Colossal Question.
Did unicorns ever exist?
Well, Mr. Blue Unicorn Guy, did you know that the first known tales of the mythical unicorn date back thousands of years to ancient Greece? The very first description we have of a unicorn comes from a Greek historian about 2,500 years ago. He said it had a white body, a purple head, blue eyes, and a multicolored horn, red at the tip, black in the middle, and white at the bottom. Like dragons, giants, or other mythical creatures, most people at the time just assumed that unicorns were real. Over time, people also started believing that unicorn horns could cure poisoning and purify water. This was bad news for narwhal populations, because while unicorns might have been a legend, narwhals were very real, and their horns could be sold as fake unicorn horns. In fact, the throne of the Kingdom of Denmark was even made of narwhal horns. So did the mythical unicorn ever really exist? No. But what if I told you another type of unicorn actually did roam the earth almost 30,000 years ago? It's called the Siberian unicorn, and, well, it looks more like a hairy rhyhorn than a unicorn. They were over 6 feet tall, 14 feet long, and mostly ate grass. But there's no word on if they're quite as majestic as their counterparts.
Are zombies real?
Zombie legends come from the African and Haitian voodoo religion. According to their beliefs, a zombie is a person brought back to life by a voodoo sorcerer or witch called a bokor. The zombie is used by the bokor as a personal slave and has to do whatever the sorcerer tells them to do. These mythical Haitian zombies might sound scary, but there's no evidence that anyone's ever been turned into a real-life zombie by a voodoo sorcerer. So then, how did myths and legends about zombies get so popular? Well, you can thank some crooked voodoo conmen for that. According to anthropologist Wade Davis, making a zombie has less to do with black magic and more to do with science. As the story goes, voodoo imposters looking to make a quick buck in the mid-1800s would tell strangers that they could take care of their enemies for a price. When a rich person with a grudge would agree to the deal, the imposters would use a secret Haitian voodoo recipe for a toxic powder made out of the flesh of a pufferfish. The imposter would walk past their unsuspecting victim on the street and blow the toxic powder in their face. The victim's heartbeat dropped so low, so fast, that people would assume they were dead. Once the poor victim was buried in a graveyard, the fake bokors would dig up the bodies in the dead of night. After a day or two, the toxins from the powder would wear off, and the victims would come to. The only problem? Days of oxygen deprivation left them brain dead. The imposter would then release their brain-dead victims into the streets of the city. When people saw a mindless, brain-dead zombie walking around the streets, our imposter would show up just in time, promising to take care of the creepy zombie himself for a price. So, are zombies real? No. But if you were one of those unsuspecting people on the streets of New Orleans and you saw the Walking Dead stagger down the road, I bet you'd believe it too. Were mermaids ever real? Creatures that are half human, half animal are fairly common in folklore from around the world, and mermaids are probably the most popular of the aquatic hybrids. Many folklorists believe that stories about mythical mermaids date back to ancient sightings of dugongs, a marine mammal that's related to the manatee. According to their theory, sailors would tell tall tales about dugong sightings they had while at sea. Those stories would be told and retold again and again, and over time, stories about the dugong turned into stories about creatures that were half human, half fish. So what gives? Were the sailors just exaggerating, or could mermaids actually be real? Well, sadly, no. Mermaids aren't real. But that might make you wonder, if mermaids aren't real, why has the myth survived for so long? Well, as time passed, the lore and legend about mermaids grew. For instance, the ancient Greek sirens were born out of mermaid legends. Sirens are mythical, mermaid-like creatures that lure sailors into rocky waters with their beautiful songs. Because of the sirens' not-so-nice reputation, mermaids began to be associated with any danger at sea, like floods, storms, and shipwrecks. Over time, that dangerous demeanor softened, and mermaids began to be known as peaceful creatures that brought good luck and could even fall in love with humans. This type of mermaid became more common in the British Isles during the 19th century and was popularized by Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Little Mermaid, which spawned a movie adaptation that I bet you heard of. Okay, so mermaids are a myth, but that doesn't mean they always were. Over the centuries, many people have reported seeing mermaids, including a couple famous sightings. While sailing through the Caribbean in 1493, good old Christopher Columbus reported seeing 3, quote, female foams rise high out of the sea. He did have one complaint though. Mermaids weren't nearly as beautiful as he'd expected. That's because Columbus's mermaids were, you guessed it, manatees. And he isn't the only famous sailor who was convinced mermaids were real. The English pirate Blackbeard would sometimes instruct his crew to steer clear of waters he considered enchanted by mermaids or merfolk. He and his crew all reported seeing mermaids with their own eyes. So, once and for all, are mermaids real? No. But you can see why someone who's been sailing the high seas for 2 months might mistake a manatee for a half-woman, half-fish hybrid. Eating nothing but lemons and moldy cheese would do that to me too. Is there any chance that Bigfoot could actually be real? Bigfoot, also known as the Sasquatch, is a legendary creature of North American folklore. He's a giant, hairy, ape-like creature who walks upright and lives deep in the wilderness. Bigfoot is considered a special type of creature called a cryptid. A cryptid is any animal whose existence is still disputed today. Other famous cryptids include mermaids, the kraken, jackalopes, the Jersey Devil, and the Loch Ness Monster, among others. But back to the cryptid in question, Bigfoot. Could he really be real? Well, most experts would say no, but there are people out there who hold out hope. Since 1920, there have been more than 3,000 separate reported Sasquatch sightings in the United States and Canada. People might find possible evidence or even claim to see Bigfoot, but so far, all those claims have proven to either be hoaxes or a case of mistaken identity. So Bigfoot probably isn't real. But I do have some surprising news. There was a creature that walked the earth that may match the description of Bigfoot. The extinct creature is called Gigantopithecus. Scientists first heard about Gigantopithecus back in 1935 when a German paleontologist named Gustav Henrik Ralph von Königswald found an abnormally large ape tooth for sale in Hong Kong. Since then, scientists have found hundreds of Gigantopithecus teeth and jaws all around Asia. Since all we've found so far are teeth and jawbones, it's hard for experts to say for sure what these giant apes looked like. But we do know they are closely related to modern orangutans and likely stood over 10 feet tall and weighed well over 1,000 pounds, more than double the weight of a gorilla. So, is Bigfoot real today? Probably not, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been all sorts of giant, majestic creatures that have walked the earth. So maybe believing in Bigfoot isn't so crazy after all. Are vampires real? The creature we think of as a classic vampire today dates back to folklore from Southern Europe in the 1700s. It all started with a series of supposed vampire sightings and executions in the early 1720s. The first and most famous case involved the corpse of a man named Peter Blagojevich. Peter supposedly died in 1725 at the age of 62, but he allegedly came back to life and showed up at his son's house asking for food. The son refused, and apparently his vampire dad didn't like that. His body was found the next day, completely drained of blood. Peter the vampire then returned again, attacking other villagers and draining them of their blood. Because of this, the incident went the 18th century equivalent of viral and quickly became a morbid fascination across Europe and America. Fascination turned to hysteria as more and more reports began to flood in from superstitious rural areas describing so-called vampire attacks. Okay, so lots of people in the 1700s definitely believed vampires were real, but why? Could it be that vampires are, in fact, real? Or if vampires never existed, why did so many people think they saw them? Well, we might actually be able to answer that. All those vampire sightings in the 1720s might have just been people suffering from the rabies virus. Rabies is carried by animals like bats, coyotes, foxes, skunks, and raccoons that can spread to humans through, a bite. Nearly all the traits we associate with vampires are also symptoms of rabies. Vampires are sensitive to light and garlic. Rabies patients have hypersensitivity too. Because they can't stand the light, vampires tend to prowl by night. Rabies affects the brain's ability to regulate your sleep cycles, causing you to be up at all hours. Vampires are known to be quite moody, but that's true with rabies too. Sufferers have mood swings, anger, confusion, and just like vampires, can turn violent. And last but not least, their bite. Over a quarter of all people with rabies are known to bite other humans. And if you're bitten by someone with rabies, well, that can give you the rabies virus too. Sound familiar?
Are leprechauns real?
According to Irish legends, leprechauns are a type of fairy that can be up to 3 feet tall. Fairies of Irish folklore aren't dainty little things with pixie dust and wings. They're tricky little creatures that love to play practical jokes. We picture leprechauns as scraggly-faced men with big red bushy beards, a green suit, knickers, and a hat with a buckle, but that wasn't always their look. Before the 1800s, leprechauns usually were described wearing red suits, not green. It wasn't until the 20th century that the modern image of leprechaun really stuck. But no matter how a leprechaun looked, the legend of the leprechaun was the same. When they're not out making mischief, most leprechauns work as shoemakers. In fact, it's said you can hear them when they're close by the tip-tap-tapping of their hammer as they drive nails into shoes. Apparently, you can make a pretty penny repairing shoes because each leprechaun has their very own pot of gold, which is usually hidden at the end of a rainbow. Finding a leprechaun is no easy feat, but anyone who catches one can take that shiny pot of gold. Legend has it that he will also grant 3 wishes once captured. But be careful, like we said, leprechauns are smart, tricky creatures, so even the smallest distraction could be enough for them to slip away. Okay, so that's the legend of the leprechaun, but are they real? No, there's no good evidence that leprechauns actually exist. But then again, they are pretty good at hiding. Did dragons ever really exist on Earth? I think deep down we all know the answer to this one. No, fire-breathing dragons never existed. Alright, so dragons aren't real, but there's stories about them everywhere all around the world. What's the deal? Why did so many people believe in dragons if they never existed? The main reason is likely because of all the big, mysterious bones people were occasionally digging up. That's right, for thousands of years, people around the ancient world were accidentally unearthing the bones of giant prehistoric animals, and dragons seemed like the most obvious answer. Experts can only theorize about which ancient animals inspired the first dragon legends, but one prehistoric creature seems like the most likely culprit. Ancient people might have been digging up dinosaur bones. If you think about it, it kinda makes sense. Dinosaurs basically look like giant lizards, and many species could be huge. Add in a little imagination, and it's easy to see how an ancient historian could confuse a dinosaur with a dragon. After all, it's only natural for people to try and make sense of something they can't explain, like giant lizard bones. Today we picture dragons as huge, ferocious, flying lizard monsters with bad intentions. But that wasn't always the case. In some stories, dragons were mean and destructive, but in others, they could be helpful and protective. They could also be just a few feet or several miles long, depending on who was telling the story. In different cultures, dragons could have the head of an elephant, lion, snake, or bird of prey, and they could be all sorts of colors: black, green, red, and more rarely, blue, yellow, or white. So why did cultures across the world believe that dragons were real? Well, they were finding giant bones of exotic creatures that looked a lot like fierce flying snakes or lizards, and you know what? Maybe they weren't that far off.
Are werewolves real?
In folklore, stories, and present-day movies, werewolves are humans with the special ability to shapeshift into a wolf, or a human-wolf hybrid creature in more modern tellings. Also called a lycanthrope, werewolves are strong, bloodthirsty brutes with an unending desire to kill animals and people with wild, wolf-like instincts. Some people supposedly became infected by a curse, usually a bite or scratch from a werewolf, which gave them their shape-shifting powers. Others were said to use an enchanted sash or a cloak made of wolf pelt to make their transformation. Usually, it only happens in the light of a full moon. The earliest known example of a historical reference to werewolves comes in one of the oldest pieces of writing that still survives today, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the tale, a woman turns her ex into a wolf. But that's just the first known example. It's super likely that other werewolf tales predated the Epic of Gilgamesh. But even if this just so happened to be the very first one ever, it's clear that werewolves have been a part of folklore for a long time. Okay, so we know the folklore is old, but what's the deal? If werewolves aren't real, where did all these stories come from? Could there possibly be any truth to the monstrous myth? Well, it turns out there might actually be some scientific and medical explanations for our werewolf fears. There are many medical conditions recognized in the modern world that might make someone seem wolf-like. Hypertrichosis is a rare condition that causes hair to grow all over the body. For some, the extra hair just grows in certain spots, but for others, it can cause the whole body to be covered in hair. Look familiar? Another possible culprit is lycanthropy, a mental disorder that causes people to believe they're a wolf or some other non-human animal. It's easy to see why people might have misunderstood these diseases in the past and assume the sick person was some kind of beast rather than plagued by a disorder. So, are werewolves real? Nope. But our fascination with them seems like it's here to stay.